And welcome, folks, to this week's edition of Check-In with the Doctor. I am, of course, your host, Chris White, and I'm delighted to welcome this week's guest, Mr. Steve Winward. Amongst other things, he actually happens to be a fellow alum of James Madison University. So this is a first, Steve. I don't know if I've ever had a fellow alum. Now, I graduated a few years before you, so I think I got you, by a few years. But Steve, I'm delighted to have you, sir. Thank you so much for being here. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me on this show.
Man, it's my pleasure. And anybody who might be joining us, it's 1 o'clock here on the East Coast, Wednesday, right in the middle of the week. By all means, if you care to say hello, ask any questions, please do so. Steve, I mentioned that you're a sales leader and a technical sales leader with Microsoft. Do you mind taking a minute and just more formally introducing yourself?
Yeah, sure. So my name's Steve Winward. I'm currently a managing director for our U.S. federal business at Microsoft. And today I lead our sales team in terms of technical sellers and interim actually leading our sales executives as well for what we call business applications. From Microsoft, from a technology perspective, that means that we include both Power Platform, which is our low-code platform, as well as Dynamics 365. I've been doing sales for about 4 years now. I actually started as an individual contributor, as a technical specialist. Before that, I did consulting and application development for about 10 years.
So you and I have a very similar background. I was an IT, software engineer, IT architect, enterprise architect for 15 years before I got into sales. And, and I know you've read my book. We may talk a little bit about that. And I'm dying to hear a little bit more about this new sort of role that you have. But before we even get there, Steve, what was sort of the biggest surprise to you, or what were some of the hardest adjustments for you moving from more of a consulting sort of post-sales role into pre-sales?
Yeah, first off, that's a great question. And as I was reading the book, you and I definitely have a very similar kind of background in that sense. For me personally, I think it was a little bit of a weird transition because, what I was selling previously in consulting was me, my time, right? What I was selling to the customers was the value every single hour that I could bill. Now, when I was a consultant, I didn't look at it right that. I really just looked at it that I just wanted to do my job and do it well. When I transitioned to sales, it became much more clear, right, what my role was. It took me some time, and the consultant in me wants to get my hands dirty and wants to get deep and wants to do the implementation, right? And that's the part that I have to try to let go of because I'm in a different capacity and we have kind of a team of people, right, that can do that. But I think looking back, what I realized and what I kind of already mentioned is in consulting, right, like I actually was selling myself. And so once I kind of made that adjustment, selling a product was no different, right? But it did take kind of a perspective to get used to that at first.
Were you, and I talked about this, certainly in the book and whenever I speak, I was a little uncomfortable with the idea of being in sales at first. Did you experience that?
I did, absolutely, right? And it was one of those things when early on, I would not tell customers I was in sales because, you kind of have that preconceived notion of what a seller would be. I think everybody kind of thinks of the classic example of a car salesperson, right? But now I'm not as shy about that. But it did take some time.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting. And I tell this to a lot of the people I work with who struggle a little bit with sort of coming to peace with the fact that we're in sales. The truth is that sales is a very noble profession, right? Yeah. I mean, ultimately to sell is to serve. Yeah. But I do think that, there's that you mentioned the car salesman, right? There's that notion, sort of the stereotype, what's it going to take to put you in this car today, right?
Right.
I mean, there's sort of that notion. And I do think that once we come to peace with it, that really changes. And to me, that's the start, right, of our career. Now, when we talked previously, you had mentioned to me that you almost had sort of a feeling of imposter syndrome. You were uncomfortable speaking in public, which of course surprises me a great deal. Do you care to elaborate a little bit on sort of those feelings and that journey that you took to overcome it?
Yeah, sure. And this is something I didn't used to share with people either, because admittedly, it took me a while to even get over that. But I joined Microsoft. I actually just hit 11 years at Microsoft a few weeks ago. And when I joined. Oh, thank you, thank you. But when I joined with Microsoft Consulting Services, and so I was really early in my career. I'd been with a startup company 2 years prior to that. I got an offer at Microsoft. I was pumped. Admittedly, I didn't really realize the magnitude of what that meant at the time. A month
Mm,
later, I got sent out to Redmond, which is Microsoft's headquarters. And in consulting services at the time, they had something called Microsoft Services University. So any consultant that was starting in the world in that time frame would go out to Redmond for 2 weeks and get training from executive coaches.
wow.
Now, that first day, it became very apparent to me that everybody around me was way smarter than I was, way more experienced than I was, and these people could just clearly articulate what it was that they needed to describe to people.
Mm,
And it was crippling. I mean, I called my parents that night, and I remember I told my mom very clearly, I think I made a mistake, and I don't think I'm going to survive here.
wow.
And for the next 2 weeks, unfortunately, it did not get better. It only got worse, because also the unfortunate thing was my manager at the time was also new, which meant that she was there with me. And she was seeing
Mm,
me feeling this anxiety and feeling this fear. And it was a snowball effect, because the more and more I thought about it, the worse it made it, the more nervous I got. One of the executive coaches pulled me to the side one day. I was like, Steve, is everything okay? And I just remember I told him, I was like, I don't know how I got here, but I'm just really feeling intimidated.
yeah.
And I will say, to my manager's point, who was fantastic, after that, she kind of pulled me to the side. We had kind of a powwow of how I could start working on public speaking and getting more comfortable with that. And over the next few years, I really was intentional about, even though it was incredibly hard, to get myself to any kind of platform that I could do to fight that uncomfortableness, but to also get the confidence that I needed. And it was not like this linear kind of thing that I started to get more comfortable with it. I had to keep fighting through it, but I'm glad I did. And so, if you fast forward, I think it was about 2 or 3 years after that, I had, at the time, for me, which was a big presentation moment for a customer, it was around 45 people.
Mm,
And I thought I knew the subject matter really well. Now, in hindsight, the scheduling of this was not the best. So right before that, I was in Redmond for a week. I decided, on paper, I decided to do a red eye flying back. So I flew
oh,
overnight. Of course, I didn't sleep on the plane. I then had my presentation. I think it was like at 11 o'clock that day.
oof.
I got about 5 minutes into it, and all of a sudden I felt cold. I felt clammy. I felt lightheaded. And I actually had to tell the people in the audience that I needed to sit down just so that I could try to recover. Now,
Wow.
on the positive thing, people in the audience were incredibly empathetic towards that. Somebody
Mm,
ran over and got me like a snack just so that I could try to get some blood sugar back.
wow.
After about 5 minutes, I got back up and I finished it. And I'm glad that I did. I'm glad I didn't just walk away from
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
And then from there, I kept trying to fight through that. So locally, what I would do is I would look for different events, meetup groups in the area, and just propose topics, right? And just say, hey, I'm passionate about this. I think this would be an interesting topic. And what was great about that is those communities were so supportive of even me being kind of a new public speaker. And so
Mm,
that is kind of how I started to get better at it.
yeah.
Now, in parallel, the other thing I noticed is when I would go to like internal Microsoft conferences or external conferences, the people that I looked up to and the people I respected were the ones that could speak really well.
Mm,
And and so I didn't really realize what I wanted to do in my career, but I knew that that was something, if I wanted to be successful, I really needed to get better at it.
yeah. That's
And bringing this kind of all back, I kind of look. We have a 4-year-old daughter now, and over the weekend, actually, she was invited to a birthday party. It was outside. It was a karate themed birthday party, and they actually invited a karate instructor. And so the
wow.
karate instructor at the end of it actually had these wooden boards. And so my daughter was incredibly nervous, but I told her, I was like, I think that you're really going to like this. And so we waited in line. She was really nervous. She was like, Daddy, I don't know if I could do it. I was like, I know that you can do this. And so she was the last to go. She was also the only one that wanted to use her hand versus her foot. All the other kids around her age used their foot to break the board. She said, no, I want to use my hand. And she did it. And the look in her face when she had that confidence, it was this moment that made me realize, back to me kind of overcoming that public speaking, that was the same thing I was doing. this is the board that she broke. That's the actual board that she broke right there.
I love it.
And so I look back and think that every time I did one of those things to fight through it, I was breaking a bigger and bigger board to get more comfortable with that. And even for this, right, this is the first time I've done like a live interview format. And I'm going to be totally honest, I'm nervous, right? But the difference is I recognize that, and I also know how to deal with it. And then lastly, I would just share too, is that I think for me, and it's been quite a journey, right? Because this has not been like overnight, I got this better. But really, when I look at the core of it, the thing that I was struggling with the most was perfectionism. And that was the thing that was crippling, because I was so worried about being absolutely perfect that I couldn't do anything. And until I got rid of that, I never got better. And the thing is that what I also realized is that customers, people, your audience, like they actually feel more connected with you if you're not perfect. Like nobody likes to hear a robot on stage. And so if you look at it instead of, I'm not perfect, but maybe that's an opportunity to connect with your audience or connect with your people and have fun with it, then all of a sudden it becomes a total game changer. And so that has kind of been my experience. I was super lucky that 2 years ago, I was selected for a technical leadership program at Microsoft. It's a year-long program. And at the end of that, I actually shared this story basically to that group of people. They came back and said, Steve, you should share that with other people. And so then I ended up putting that on my YouTube channel, which I started last fall. And I've gotten some cool feedback from that. And, you know, people that I'd never even met who just reached out and were like, thank you for doing that. And I do think it's one of those things that a lot of people wrestle with. And I'm just glad I could put it out there. I'm glad that I could share my story. And if anybody out there is struggling with that, just know like it's not an overnight thing. But lastly, I would just say for me, the other thing is I'm actually really appreciative that it wasn't easy, because I probably would have taken for granted what it is to be a public speaker if it just kind of came naturally to me. And so that, like, I think I do appreciate the journey, while in that moment when the executive coach pulled me to the side and I had called my parents and told them I didn't think it was going to make it, was terrified.
Yeah. I have to say, I really appreciate hearing your story. I mean, one of the thoughts that comes to mind for me, Steve, is authenticity. I mean, the authenticity with which you speak is just honestly, it's endearing. Incidentally, my friend Matt Elsom out in he's in Europe. It's what makes you human and makes real connection possible. Very well said, Matt. And by the way, Matt, it's always good to see you. Thanks for joining. Matt is with Emma 3D, one of the software vendors in the space. But Steve, and by the way, if anybody else cares to say hello, ask a question, please feel free to chime in. It's always good to see who's with us. But Steve, as I was saying, you know, the first thing that really struck me is your authenticity, your willingness to be vulnerable, and to a certain degree, you know, whenever we take the stage or pick up the mic, so to speak, right, we're putting ourselves at risk. And to be very honest, I find myself humbled a little bit, because if I'm perfectly honest with you and anybody who might be listening, speaking in public's actually come very natural for me, you know, and I'm not even sure why. Maybe I'm not afraid enough of being. And hey, Craig Lett with Connection. Hey, Craig, Craig, good to see you, my friend. Thanks for joining. But it's a good reminder for me, Steve, that for some people it's not that easy to stand up in front of an audience. And you also use the word intentional. You were very intentional with your approach. You were very intentional with the way you went about things. And honestly, if I'm fully honest, I still get a tad nervous before anytime I even do one of these still, you know. Sure, I think, sure. And you know, if we're honest, like, what is the physical reaction to nervousness, right? You know, our heartbeat increases a little bit. We have butterflies in our stomach, right? What is the physical reaction to excitement? Our heart rate goes up, right? So like nerves and excitement are actually very similar physical reactions. So I know I try to turn the nerves into excitement. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So anyway, no, I think that's a great story. Do you mind if I switch subjects just a little bit? And
Sure.
so here you are, you're an IT consultant. You go to Microsoft's Service University or what, whatever. You're feeling a little overwhelmed. You're feeling a little bit like an imposter. And yet here you are, what, 4 years later, you're now running a team of what, 20 plus sales engineers. And if I understand correctly, you're running a team of sales engineers and now account executives. Do I have that right?
I am, yeah. So we call them sales executives, but yeah. So
Sales
effectively,
executives.
sellers paired with the technical sellers on a team together. And just for a short little clarification, the Microsoft Services University was 11 years ago, but for the
That
last
was
4 years, I've
11
been
years
in
ago. Okay.
the sales side, and then the last 6 months, I just took on a management role. And then the last month, now I'm interim leading also the sales execs in addition to the technical sellers. But yes, so absolutely. So a team of about 21 people today.
Yeah, yeah. And so what have you learned? So you've only been in the sales engineer leader role for about 6 months, but that's enough time to sort of get a sense for some of the challenges you're dealing with. Now you're dealing with the entire team. Has that sort of changed your perspective on how to manage the team and what some of the challenges are in both directions?
Yes, absolutely. Right. And so I think for me, one of the things is it's just given me a much better perspective on the different roles, because I think that, anytime you're in a certain role, you can have assumptions, right? Or maybe there's some stereotypes about what the other role does or does not do. And I think people can make assumptions. Well, like my job's way harder than their job. And I'll just say both roles are equally important and also equally challenging in their own right. But I do think it's given me a much better kind of understanding from a business perspective, and
Yeah.
also just a much better kind of understanding in terms of leading a team of technical sellers, how we can better work together with our counterparts as well.
Yeah. Were you concerned that the sales executives might not either respond to you or respect you the way they might a more, I guess, official or traditional sales leader?
Yes. And so if we go back to the imposter syndrome and we go back to the fear of public speaking, it's a similar thing. And it's been a month, and I think for the most part, people do respect me, and it's been a great experience. But absolutely, like I have felt that kind of all over again in terms of
Are
the
there
imposter syndrome.
are there specific things that you have done maybe differently with the sales executives to maybe begin to build those relationships and earn that trust?
It's a couple of things. I think being vulnerable. So, if I don't know something, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. I'll just say, "Oh, that's a great question. I need to get back to you." Or I'll take it as an opportunity to ask them, "What would you do in this case?" Right? Um, and also kind of to lean in and just try to understand from them their kind of experiences, because they have a ton of experience that they can share with me. And then it's given me an opportunity to really kind of hone in on some of those things that, admittedly, as a technical sales lead, I had some gaps on. And so I think just being honest and being transparent has been the thing that's helped with that.
How is that? How is this? It sounds like at some point they will probably, fill that position and you'll go back to being primarily technical sales
Yes.
lead. How do you think this experience will change the way you manage that team?
I think it definitely will. And so, like, in hindsight, I'm super fortunate that this has happened. And yes, it will get backfilled hopefully in about a month or so. But I think leading the technical sales engineers, for me, I have a much better perspective on the sales executive role. I also have a much more better perspective on how we actually report our business financials and all of that. And so what can we do from a technical sales perspective to really make the most impact from a business, from a finance perspective? And so I think that's given me a lot better kind of understanding in terms of how we can go after.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I think there's a great deal of power in that, particularly because, and I think this is your story, most SE managers, right? Most technical sales managers, technical sales directors are promoted at some point from the individual contributor role into that manager role. I work with a lot of SE managers that are in their first role as an SE leader, and they struggle to make that transition, right? And I think that was your story, right? You were an individual contributor, moved into, but now having the opportunity to see it from the sales point of view, I think is incredibly powerful. What were some of the things that maybe surprised you or challenged you when you first made the move from individual contributor to sales manager?
I think a couple of things. So, some of them, it's one of those things you talk, like I have a lot of mentors before I took this manager role on. And so I thought that I knew kind of what it would be to be managing a team of people, but then it's another thing to actually live it. And so, for example, time management, you hear that, but until you're faced with that yourself, incredibly hard, right? And so something that I have to be, once again, really intentional about to make sure that I'm not getting overloaded on a given day with kind of the things that I'm taking on. The other thing I think, and I think this is common for other people too, but for me, going from an individual contributor role to a manager role does mean I need to delegate a lot more. And that is something I'm still working on. But, once again, it goes back to, at the root of it, I'm that kind of consultant that wants to kind of be able to do everything. I can't do that in a manager role. And so I do need to be able to delegate that out as well. Those are probably like the two biggest things, at least kind of top of mind with the transition.
Yeah, and when I think back to when I made that transition, so I first got into pre-sales in 2005. I was in IC for 5 years, and then managed my first team in 2010. And I think that was what I struggled with the most. Was, if I'm fully honest, was letting go, right, and delegating. And I think a lot of us struggle with that for sure. One of the things you mentioned to me is that you've been trying to sort of build and lead the team around this notion of selling in the open. And I rather like that term. It sort of caught my attention. Do you mind elaborating on what it is that you mean by selling in the open?
Yeah, sure. And so for me, coming from my background, so like I was a software developer consultant. And so also Microsoft, we own GitHub. And so like that's always been something that's kind of a passion of mine. But when I took on this role, one of the things that I did is I created this platform. So we actually have a public GitHub repository. Anybody can go to that. It's the Federal Business Applications GitHub repository on the Microsoft org. And what we're doing now is when we have some of these like proof of concepts or demos that we're delivering, and we think it's worthwhile for other customers to see, we can kind of genericize those, put them out on GitHub and make them available. And so for us, we're targeting the US federal government market, and we're really trying to build a community around that. So it gives our customers an idea that we deeply care about them. We want them to see much more relevant content and demos that are out there. And so the pattern with that is that sometimes we have sample solution files. We might have a YouTube video that's associated with that. We may reference other things. But it's all out there, and we hope that it's a way that people can self-discover things that maybe they didn't before. But what's also cool about it too is that we've had partners of us that have actually contributed content to that. So it's not just a Microsoft run thing that we're doing. We have people outside that are kind of building this community to make that better. So it's almost like a landing site for, in our case, what we're trying to drive and what we can offer to the federal government. And it's been a lot of fun. And so that is a passion of mine, but I think it's been really helpful. And also on top of that, I do think, in COVID, things have changed. And so pre-COVID, 2 years ago, I would be traveling, I would be meeting people in person, I would be commuting. I'm not doing really any of that right now. And I think at least as of right now, that's still kind of the case. But I also think with that, like our schedules have changed a lot. And one of the things is like, I'm not really commuting anymore. I'm sure our customers in a lot of cases aren't really commuting anymore. Many people are working from home, but it's not like we now have that free time where we used to commute. And I think schedules have just compressed. People assume that we're just connected 24/7. And I think from a time perspective, like the one-on-one, right? Like what I would call like the synchronous time that we have with each other has really kind of gone down. But I do think having something available that people can self-discover, and what I call more like asynchronous time, meaning like they can do it on their own time and learn about our stuff. And maybe that's a way to kind of pre-qualify that they're interested in something, and then we can really kind of dive into it.
I absolutely love that. And I want to pick that apart a little bit, because I think the two key things that you mentioned there, first of all, this notion, what I'm hearing is transparency, right? Like we want to put stuff out there. We want our customers to have visibility. And I also hear sort of collaborative selling, right? The buyers are involved in the process. The buyers, can engage and inform themselves, and they feel like, and it's almost like this idea of collaborative design, right? So I absolutely love that. The other thought that comes to mind is that, this notion of the fact that we're all back-to-back meetings, right? And you're right. None of us we all seem to have less time than we did before, yet nobody's traveling,
Yeah.
which is counterintuitive, right? It doesn't make any sense. And so what I hear you saying is that because you can't get together, you're really creating a community, right? You're creating a community of like-minded people, where they can collaborate through, these platforms, these environments, or what have you. And I think it does give people a way to feel connected, right? It makes them feel like they're part of something, right?
And this may sound silly, but I would love to just be stuck on the bridge going into DC just so I could have a little bit of quiet time where I could just listen to a podcast. Like I don't it's weird to say that, but I would love to be able to do that right now.
That is correct. I have to admit, I'm not sure I'm ready to go quite that far because I spent far too many times stuck on a bridge in DC. But I can completely and totally appreciate what you're saying. Incidentally, Steve, speaking of people's times, let me pause and just welcome anybody who may have decided to spend a few minutes with us, sharing a few thoughts. If you're out there, and Steve and I don't have visibility on who's out there, so if you care to say hello through the chat or through the comments, of course, please do so. If you have any questions for Steve or myself, please feel free to share. We always love to hear from folks that are out there. Steve, another thing that I wanted to discuss is, I know you've been in this role for about 6 months, and I'm sure your team is looking to you for guidance, so looking to you for advice.
Yep.
What are some of the more important pieces of advice that you either share with your team and or advice that you give to people who maybe are thinking about entering the pre-sales profession, maybe struggling with some challenges early in their career, et cetera?
Yeah, great question. And so when I took on the role, a couple of things. So one is I wanted to be able to find something that I could reference. So it wasn't just like Steve's opinion, but it was something that was kind of out there. And that's how I actually came across your book. And it was kind of this weird journey that I found it, but effectively somebody I was connected to through LinkedIn is a part of, I believe it's the Pre-Sales Collective, which you are also a part of.
Yep.
And when I saw that, then I saw that you had written this book. And I was like, that's really interesting because it's actually geared towards technical sellers. Got it on Amazon. I'm, by the way, not like a crazy reader, but like this one, I thought it was for me very approachable, very concise, and it was just really easy to kind of understand it. And once I did that, I reached out to my team and I asked everybody, I was like, please expense this book. Let's do a team event to talk about this because I'd love to hear your perspective on that. That's also when then I reached out to you over LinkedIn. I kind of cold called you, but I wanted to just reach out to you to let you know, hey, like your book was super helpful because it confirmed some things that I kind of thought of myself. So that was really good, especially as a new manager. But it also gave me some really awesome ideas that I could lead the team with as well. And so then you came back and you're like, hey, that's awesome. Maybe I could also join the team call that you have. And so we ended up having that together. It was an awesome discussion. And what I thought was so cool about that is that the people on my team were able to come to you with actual issues that they were facing. Like, for example, one woman on my team, she was like, hey, I literally just got out of a customer call. That's why I was late. This just happened. What do you think? And I felt like everybody on our team was able to open up and kind of share that. And I just thought that was a really cool experience, especially as kind of a newly formed team to be able to do that together.
Yeah. Well, and I certainly appreciate those words. One of the things that I tell, a lot of the folks that I work with is there is so much talent and experience internally in your own team. And I think for people who maybe are a little bit newer in the profession, in the career, to your point, find a mentor, look to people for advice.
Yeah.
And if you've been in the profession, I think, I think we all sort of have this journey in pre-sales. And I think the first 5 years, honestly, I think we're trying to figure it out for a couple of years. And then from years like 2 to 5, we sort of hit our stride and we're just out there killing it in many cases. But I think once we've done it for about 5 years, we're looking sort of for the next step, right? Sometimes it's management, like yourself, right? Sometimes it's sales. Some people go into product. And then for others, I think it's becoming maybe a senior or a principal-y. But I think the real definition is mentoring others and developing others, right? Once we ourselves get to the point where we're pretty confident and comfortable in our role. Incidentally, speaking of, you have a couple fans.
Hey, Siobhan.
Hello, Siobhan and Stephen Craig Harris.
Thank you, Craig.
You got to say hello to your folks. So you mentioned the book, and of course I appreciate that. And you probably haven't memorized the 6 habits quite like I have, but as you think about the 6 habits, and more importantly, the things that we as sales engineers need to be skillful in doing, are there certain areas that you think are most important, or have you discovered have been most important for you in your career and the success of your team?
I think for me, there's a couple things that kind of resonate with me in the book. And actually now in my role, leading 2 different roles, right? Leading technical sellers as well as the sales executives. One of the things you call out in your book is that sales is a team sport. And I feel like I have a much greater appreciation of that now, having both of those roles reporting to me. And I think that's really important to understand, because in sales, you're not doing that alone. You're not doing that on an island, and you have to be able to work together across a lot of different virtual teams. So I think that's really important. The other one that I think was really interesting when you called out the fact that, if you're doing the same kind of workaround in a demo multiple times, like, let's make sure that's documented. We're trying to do some of that with our GitHub repository, right? We're putting things out there where if we get common kinds of objections, it's out there, right? So anybody can kind of get to that. So I think that's a really good one too. And then in terms of the demo itself, there's some really great stuff in there in terms of making sure you click absolutely everything. I have done that many, many times myself, but it's still super critical. And the other one, and I forget exactly how you phrased it in the book, but I remember it was something along the lines of, what if every presentation or every demo, you felt like you put it all out there on the field? And to me, I love that feeling, because it's like, it's not binary necessarily how your demo went, but if you feel that way, that you just put it all out there, like, that is a great way to describe that.
It's funny you bring that up. I think I forgot that I wrote something about leaving it all on the field, and you're the first person to, in 2.5 years to remind me that I said something about that. But I do think there is something to that. I think you always want to feel like you've left it on the field. It's interesting. I actually had the opportunity to do a workshop this morning, in fact, with a client that I have, and it was a group. Honestly, it was a group of their high performing sales engineers. And yet there's still a number of things that they struggle with, and one of the things that one of the individuals, one of the team members, are struggling with. They said, Chris, sometimes I feel like we get to the point where the customer is actually eager to move forward, and of course the AE is eager to move forward. Yet I'm not certain that the customer's even done all the due diligence they need to do to avoid like running into snags post implementation, right? And this individual was like, I feel guilty because I feel like that's going to come back on me, And I said, look, at the end of the day, I mean, all we can do is present the best information, the best evidence, right? That validates and justifies the solution and the investment, right? And demonstrates the value of the investment, right? To the extent that we can. And, I mean, in essence, what this person was saying was, I think the customer may be making the right decision for the wrong reason, right? Or they don't realize some of the pitfalls that they're going to hit. And my response was, you know what, you can't hold yourself. I mean, at some point, customers have to take responsibility for the success of the implementation, right? You know, at the end of the day. So do you and your team run into anything like that from time to time?
I mean, absolutely, yes. And to your point, I think like when you think about kind of it's a team sport, like I think you have to have the trust and the faith that whether it's a partner doing the implementation, whether it's internal professional services, or if it's the customer doing it, right, that they're going to do it. And it's on us that we can certainly educate them. But I do think, you know, it comes back to me as the consultant, right? Like I I would be predicting the things that as a consultant I would be having challenges as, right? Like if I were actually implementing it myself. But on the sales side, it's a little bit different. You have to have just, I think, that trust, right? That they're going to be able to do the things they need to do to be successful. But I do think it's a great point too that you're mentioning that the customer has to own the fact that they need to be able to do the right things to be successful too. Because sometimes I think we forget about that part.
Yeah. Yeah. At the end of the day, I mean, it's a two-way street,
Yeah.
right? And I mean, how many times do we see customers and just organizations buying software, frankly, buying services, right? But or making investment decisions, but specifically buying software for the right reason with all the right intentions, but they didn't have the right project team behind it, right? They didn't have the right change management team behind it, and maybe the project failed. It has, and by the way, oftentimes the tool gets blamed, right? Is it really the fault of the tool? Of course not, right? I mean, we need to make sure we know what we're getting ourselves into. So anyway, and you and I sell to the government. Well, once upon a time, I used to sell to the government. I know you still work with the government now. Unfortunately, we see this a lot in the government. That's a whole other conversation. And we'll leave that one alone. I'm not going to turn this into a political conversation, at least, although you and I live, you know, we're surrounded by it here in the DC area. Steve, when you reflect on your career, are there things from time to time that you find yourself maybe wishing you had done differently, or maybe things that you wish you had learned earlier in your career?
Yeah, you know, that's also a really good question. And I have a couple of thoughts on that. One is, so like when I joined Microsoft, you know, like it's weird to say over a decade ago, in consulting services, the thing that I focused on was just doing a great job for my customer. Looking back, the thing I did not do a good job of is focusing on my personal brand, focusing on networking, focusing on understanding what are the different opportunities. Because at least at Microsoft, it's a massive company. There's lots of different organizations. I wish I would have figured that out sooner. And I would say to that, like on the networking side of it, networking truly is work. Like it doesn't just happen. You have to, once again, be intentional about it. And I look at it like, you know, every 2 weeks, I'm going to set some time on my calendar so that maybe I could talk to somebody new in the organization that I haven't talked to before. Maybe there's some way that I could kind of understand that. And, you know, what I've shared with other people too, is I think a lot of times when, you know, sometimes people are afraid to reach out to people they've not talked to before in a company. But what I found is if I were to reach out and say, hey, your role and your team looks really interesting. Would you be willing to tell me more about it? 95% of the time people are flattered and people want to tell you about what they do, right? Like that people like naturally just really enjoy that conversation. And so
Of course.
I wish I would have figured that out sooner, right? And that's a big part of it.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting to hear you say that. I mean, I think you're right. You mentioned, you know, our personal brand, and I'm certain it wasn't something that I thought about early. I mean, for crying out loud, or early in my career, I think I was similar to what you were saying, right? I just wanted to do a good job, make some good money, right? And you know, I mean, and I think as we age, as we mature, right? Certainly not only in our profession, but individually, right? Our priorities change, and just our awareness changes. You know, I mean, I'm in my, you know, mid 50s at this point. You mentioned you got a 4-year-old at home. I just sent my 4-year-old, who's now an 18-year-old, off to college. So
Nice.
you know, and she's the youngest of 5. So
Wow.
you know, I'm sort of on the other side of that equation. And you know, if there's anything that I've learned, because certainly I reflect. I mean, look, I was 51 when I published the book, or
Mhm.
yeah, 50, 51 when I published the book. 50, I didn't launch this business until I was 52. And look, I had some false starts along the way, you know, but I also realized that every step on the journey, even though they included plenty of mistakes, were important steps
Mhm.
along the journey, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and I see you as someone who, you're now mid-career, you've learned some important steps along the way, and now you're in a position where you can guide and advise and lead others, now in your position, and what a great opportunity. So where do you see yourself going? Do you see yourself continuing on the sales engineer, sales leadership path?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's something that I always kind of reflect on. Right now, like I love what I'm doing. We've got a great team, and like I'm passionate about the technology. And it's just, to me, it's a really nice combination of, we go back to public speaking, technology, solving difficult problems for customers, and that part, just I'm super passionate about. And I wake up every morning truly just like really excited to get into my day. Um, I don't know where that's going to take me, but for right now, like I'm just trying to be in the moment and enjoy it. It's only been 6 months as a manager. Admittedly, it feels like it's been longer than 6 months, but it's only been 6 months, and so like I want to focus on this role right now. I want to be great at kind of what I'm doing, and then in a couple of years, who knows? We'll see where it kind of goes from there. But right now, it's been a lot of fun, and I'm happy where I'm at.
That's awesome. Well, and as Simon Sinek would say, unfortunately, you're in the vast minority if you can honestly say, I love my job. And it sounds like you honestly say you love your job and you wake up every day. Unfortunately, there's too many people who don't. And hopefully you're creating, and it sounds like you most certainly are creating, a work environment in which your teams can wake up every day and say they love their job. It's like, Steve, again, allow me to press the pause button, folks. If, for those of you who are still with us, first of all, thank you for spending a few minutes with Steve and I. It's always good to have people on with us live. If you'd like to say hello or ask Steve any questions, or myself, of course, please feel free to do so. We'll chat for a few more minutes and then call it a day. Actually, Steve, I usually close these conversations with a bit of a lightning round. Now, you've sat in on a few of these, so you may know the questions that are coming. But may I ask you a few questions in this lightning round?
Yeah, let's do it. Yeah, let's hear it.
So the first question is, have you, or can you think back to any demo that you yourself gave that went particularly poorly? And if so, why? What was it that went poorly?
First, I wish I could say that none of my demos have gone poorly, but there's quite a few that I'm going through in my head. But there's one that kind of stood out to me, and so this was probably 3 years ago. At the time, I was doing a product called Power BI, which is our business intelligence tooling for Microsoft, which also happened to be paired with this brand new product that came out at the time called Workplace Analytics for Microsoft. So I was like, Power BI was my bread and butter. I was super deep on that. I could, do those things in my sleep. A seller had reached out to me and was like, hey, I've got this customer that's really into workplace analytics. We'd love to learn more about it. I said, sure. And I kind of stepped up for that. I looked at that as kind of a stretch opportunity. But admittedly, I did not really get as deep on that product as I should have. We had internally just this deck, and it was just kind of a click-through deck. And that's what I then brought to the table to the customer. The other critical thing, that I'm glad I learned this early, was that I didn't even ask who's the audience for the customer, right? I just kind of went in there and presented. And I presented this slide deck that was just click through. It was not personalized. And it landed really badly. And luckily, I have a great relationship with that seller. And he was honest with me. He was like, hey, Steve, I think you could have done a much better job. But I took that as a really good learning opportunity. And I learned a couple things. Absolutely make sure you understand your audience and who the key players are, because in that setting, it was some pretty senior level people. And so like looking back on it, just not great, but it was a great opportunity to learn on that and to really make sure I do my homework, really do my due diligence, and take it as an opportunity to make sure I can actually connect with the people I'm talking to, not just we go back to being a robot and just kind of, presenting a couple slides on a screen.
And it's so powerful. I mean, first of all, know your audience. I mean, know the players, right? Know who's going to be in the room. I mean, that is one of my first rules. And then, as you said, you know, the reason, you know, my sense is the reason you stepped up to the plate and took advantage or you know, agreed to do the meeting is because you wanted to look good. Right?
I know. Yeah.
It was more about you. It was like, hey, I want to talk about this. I want to demonstrate how smart I am. I want to demonstrate that I've learned this. Right. And so, and you go in, and what are we focusing more on? Our stuff, right? And our slides and our stuff. And then even worse, to find out that maybe I don't know it even as well as I thought I did. Right. So, and by the way, we've all made that mistake, you know, probably more on more than one occasion. Incidentally, I just want to thank Steve. And I don't know, Steve, if I pronounce your name incorrectly. I think it's Pusilik, but maybe I'm wrong. But thanks for chiming in, Steve. It's good to see you. And Craig, favorite quote of mine: being a great leader is not about being in charge; it's about taking care of those in charge. Very good. Thanks for your comment, Craig. Again, it's always good to see you. But no, I really appreciate you sharing that story, Steve. I know you may have some of your folks even listening, so you're being, you know, you continue to be authentic and vulnerable even with them on. So I appreciate that. So that was the first of 3 questions. The second question is, let's turn the tables. Have you been on the receiving end of a demo that went particularly well? And if so, what about that demo was so effective?
Yeah. And so another really good question. I'm going to bring this back to your book here in a second. But, you know, as being a manager over the last 6 months, I have had to interview candidates for the team. And one of the things with that process is that I actually set in place that we do technical screening, but like the really kind of the pinnacle thing of that interview is a 15-minute presentation where we give them a use case and we kind of give them who the audience is going to be. So we say it's going to be a CFO, a CIO, a business analyst, and a developer. And you got 15 minutes. And then they have kind of freedom of how they want to do that.
Wow.
Also, with those people, I've also recommended that they read your book. Like if they're interested in, sorry, I'm having trouble with the camera there. But if they're interested in actually learning more about what this role is, like let's read that book because it's great. One of the people that went through that process, I could tell actually read your book because in the 15 minutes was very creative in the sense that actually took that to do an intro to understand what the names of everybody in the audience were. And then throughout the presentation actually called us out by name. And so I thought that was really cool. And it comes back to me kind of with your question, when people are really effective at demos, I think they're able to connect with their audience, however it happens to be. And the kind of fascinating thing to me is that they have to do it in their own authentic self, because I could not be Chris White, for example, right? But for me, I'm kind of more of this nerdy kind of, you know, I did math in undergrad, I did math and computer science. So like sometimes I tie like weird math history into my things, but I can do that because it's authentic to me. And so if I go back to kind of the finals that we did for the team, the people that did the best in those presentations were the ones that could connect with the audience and do it kind of in their authentic self.
I mean, I'm honestly, I'm first of all humbled by the words that you've shared and the story you've shared, and honestly inspired. I couldn't have said it any better myself. I mean, be yourself, be personable, make authentic connections, and don't. And honestly, Steve, I've said in a number of the workshops and things that I do that, you know, that I tell people, look, don't try to be me if you're not, you know, a loudmouth, hand waving, you know, kind of guy. But I think you're the first person I've ever actually heard say, you know, I can't be Chris because that's just not who I am. And I mean, honestly, those are inspiring words. I'm really touched by those comments. So I think that's you know, really meaningful. So I have one last question. People always tell me this is the hardest question that I ask. So I'll throw it your way and see what you think. If you could ask me one question, what might it be?
So on that one, I think the question I would ask is, because I'm actually just curious myself. I know you said that recently you published your book. What is the process like to publish a book? I've heard it can actually be pretty challenging, right? And you get in kind of these like periods where there's kind of like epic highs and lows, and you can run into writer's block. But I'm just curious from your perspective, like, what was that like? What was your experience like? How long did it take kind of to put it together?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. My story, I do think, is a little bit interesting. I had an inspiration to write this book for well over 3 years, and I had numerous starts and stops. And in spite of my numerous starts and stops, I don't think I'd actually written anything more than about 40 pages at best. And I honestly, Steve, as desperately as I want, as much as I believed that I had something worth writing, and as desperately as I wanted to get it out of my brain, I honestly didn't think it would ever happen.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting story. I attended a sales, I think it was called Sales 2.0 or Sales 3.0 conference in San Francisco in 2018. I think it was October, November 2018. And I saw all these small business owners, men and women, who were running sales coaching and sales training businesses of different shapes and sizes and contexts on stage, sort of pitching their position and their methodology and their solution. And I desperately wanted to be one of those people on the stage at a conference like this. And what I discovered was every one of them had written a book, started a business based on the book. And I just made up my mind then, I need to write, if I'm ever going to do this with my career, and I believed I could, I need to write a book. I still couldn't. I came back full of excitement, full of momentum, full of enthusiasm. And honestly, probably by January, February, I was like, it's just never going to happen. And then I found a book publishing coach. And by the way, I'm not sure if I found him or he found me. And I in one way or another, we connected. And Steve, what he said to me in our first conversation, I'll never forget. He said, Chris, if you do everything I tell you to do, when I tell you to do it, your book will be published in 2 months or less as an Amazon bestseller.
Wow.
And I wasn't sure I believed him, Steve, but I desperately wanted to.
Yeah.
Do you know I hired him on April 22nd of 2019, 2 days before my 51st birthday. And I published the book on June 21, less than 2 months later.
Wow.
And that day, it made it to the number one bestseller spot on new releases in a couple of different categories.
That's awesome. That's amazing.
By the way, I wrote him a big check. When I hired him, I wrote him the day that I hired him, I wrote him a big check. And why do I share that? I made the commitment.
Yeah.
I was all in at that point. And in essence, I tell people he basically kicked me in the rear end and out popped the book. And it was just having someone to lead me down the path and help me focus. And throughout the entire thing, he would say to me almost every other day or every other week, Chris, completion over perfection.
Yeah.
And you were talking about perfection early on. And so there you go. And I literally, and the actual sitting down and writing took about 2 weeks.
Wow.
Like literally, and it was a lot of work and it was a lot of focus. And I had a couple of literally like 16-hour days of just writing, but it took focus and I did it. And here's the honest to God truth, Steve. Publishing a book is actually not nearly it's not nearly as hard anymore as it used to be. I'm self-published. I'm published on Amazon. You can do it's all do it yourself. I mean, there's no rocket science involved in the least. Wow. So anyway, a bit of a long-winded story, but I appreciate you asking, and hopefully the 10 minutes or so I took to answer your question was worthwhile. So there you go.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. Yeah, thank you. That was it was really interesting.
So yeah, and I will say, and I've said this to many people, and I'll share with you and anybody listening. I do believe that most of us have at least one book in us, and if any of you, if you feel as though you have a book in you, I encourage you to not give up. Sort of, don't let go of that inspiration. And if anybody ever wants to reach out to me for some advice, I'm not the best person in the world to give advice on this, but certainly I've been through it once, and I'm happy to share the lessons I learned along the way. So, Steve, if you can believe it or not, we have been chatting for almost an hour. You've been an absolutely delightful guest. You've been very gracious with your time and giving of your time. And I so appreciate some of your comments, your words, your authenticity. Any thoughts from you, just in closing, anything you care to share with anybody who may still be hanging around?
Yeah. First off, thank you for everybody that joined today. And if people want to reach out or connect, I would love to do that. You can feel free to do that on LinkedIn. And if people want to talk about imposter syndrome or public speaking, or if you feel comfortable sharing that story, I'd love to hear from you as well.
Fantastic. Well, Steve, thank you so much. And are you following the JMU Duke? So I think our football team is doing okay this year. We're not as good as we've been in past years. Do you follow the football team at all?
I am not a good Duke this year, so I've not been following the football team. But I'll have to check into that.
All right. Well, we'll close with Go Dukes. Steve, thank you so much. Good to see you. Everybody, thank you so much for hanging around. As always, it's good to see you. You know how to find me. You know how to find Steve. Be well, all. See you.
All right. Thank you.
Bye-bye.